Hey there, A Pushers, Escriture and Vieira. I'm here to bring you chapter 13, the Sectional Crisis. So, in this chapter, we're really going to talk about what's going to lead to the fracture of the United States and lead to the Civil War. So, let's kind of pay attention to these things and think about them like chronologically as we're moving towards the outbreak of war in 1860. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to look at is sectionalism. So, we have seen sectionalism throughout this class so far, from looking at the differences between the northern colonies, the middle colonies, and the southern colonies. And hopefully by now you understand that those things, those differences in like political ideology, in economics, in social aspects has continued to be features of the United States thus far. Okay, so for the pretty much the first portion of United States history leading up to the Civil War, really leading up to prior to Civil War, I guess, about to 1820, Americans were pretty content to just kind of compromise over this issue of slavery. And Northerners, for the most part, kind of absolved themselves from the issue, although we know that they were very deeply involved in the institution of slavery via the market revolution in the North and factories and all those types of things that we've been really reiterating over the past couple months. And as the United States expands west, as we start to gain more territory from the Louisiana Purchase and then later from the Mexican Cession, the issue of slavery continues to play a more prominent role in American politics, in social circles, and certainly in the economy. Okay, so the first kind of struggle that we have is in the Ohio River Valley, and that really becomes the first kind of battleground, setting the stage for what's going to follow later. And what comes out of the Ohio River Valley, which the Ohio River is east of that or west of the Appalachian Mountains, and it's going north to south, and it kind of divides what will become the South and what will become more known as the North. So we have the Missouri Compromise of 1820, and that was really a turning point in this American sectionalism because it really showed how decisive and divisive the issue of slavery had become in the nation. So Southerners and Northerners point to different parts of the U.S. Constitution that say, whether or not slavery would be existed, whether or not, or would be allowed, would it not be allowed, and whether or not the federal government could touch the issue of slavery, or if that was left up to states themselves. And so we have the Missouri Compromise sets out the 3630 line, which basically says that any land, any new states above the 3630 parallel line would be free from slavery, and then any states down below would be open to slavery. We don't really have this idea of popular sovereignty, but keep that kind of in your mind as we move through this chapter. But again, the issue of slavery is starting to kind of boil, if you will, in the pot. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Vieira.
All right, so I'm going to cover, keeping with this sectional crisis that the chapter revolves around, I'm going to focus on the political sectionalism of the time. So a couple of things. The Second Great Awakening creates this divide amongst America's religious communities. You begin to see major churches like the Baptist, Presbyterian Church breaking up into sectional branches, a Northern and a Southern Baptist church, with pretty much the main difference being their views on slavery. We referenced this in the previous chapter on how oftentimes Southern religious leaders would use biblical references to sort of defend slavery. And so you began to see the sectionalism of the country not just being a political sectionalism, but also religious in nature as well. Jackson's Democratic Party really tries to not touch the issue of slavery in the 1820s and 1830s. They try to recruit voters both in the North, South, and in the West by focusing on issues of white supremacy, focusing on issues of expansionism, and how they wanted to build a nation that was increasingly moving west and increasingly was looking after the rights and privileges of white men. So really the Democratic Party early in the 1920s and into the 1930s, they really don't address the issue of slavery as much when they are recruiting voters or crafting their platforms. Then the Whigs enter the conversation. And so the Whigs offer a alternative choice to the Democratic Party, but they really never build a cohesive voting bloc. The problem with the Whig political party is that it really wasn't a unified political party. depending on where you were, depending on where you lived, your belief system was very different if you were a Whig. And so they're never able to really build a strong national following. There was a abolitionist party in the 30s and 40s, the Liberty Party, and their platform was basically around abolition. And they were they're focused on creating a political party that was single issue. Their single issue was stopping slavery in the United States. Few Americans really vote for that political party. It's kind of just more of a footnote in American history. And the Democrats continue to dominate national politics, with the Whigs being kind of the plus one, the alternative choice. Texas and the admission into Texas as a slave state is a major turning point in the sectionalist crisis. When Texas enters the Union as a slave state, really with the push of Polk, a Democratic president, and the war that was created, in a sense, basically to bring Texas into the fold, it's pretty clear to Northern Democrats that their political party is the party of slavery. And so you begin to see a split, which is going to be kind of even further driven home, but with the Kansas-Nebraska controversy, amongst the Democratic Party, in which Northern Democrats tend to see their political party being run by Southern Democrats, who were obviously the pro-slavery party. The first major third-party threat to the Democrats and the Whigs was the Free Soil Party. The Free Soil Party actually is rather significant in that they have some pretty heavy players in American politics join them. Mark Van Buren and a couple others who try and create a more of a national political party. They do win a dozen seats in the House. They win a Senate seat, and they do have some national play. But again, compared to the strength that the Democratic Party has throughout the nation, both in the North and then especially in the South, the Free Soilers aren't going to really hold the candle to the power that the Democrats have. In 1848, of course, the Seneca Falls Convention starts to really drive the abolitionists, force the Seneca Falls Convention, the Women's Rights Convention, focusing on the issue of women's suffrage, really kind of fans the flames of abolition. Frederick Douglass was a speaker at the convention. Frederick Douglass, obviously, being the most famous abolitionist of the antebellum time period. And so Seneca Falls, the Free Soil Party, you really start to see the forces of abolition now having a voice. They're not going to take a backseat to the Democratic Party. They're going to begin to challenge the Democratic Party more directly. So I will turn it back over to Eskridge, and we're going to talk about our home state, the great state of California.
Yes. All right. So to the Golden State. All right. So California seeks admission to the United States after gold is discovered at Sutter's Mill. And as we've seen, as VR just talked about, as states are entering, this issue over slavery is really starting to divide the country politically. We're starting to see the rise of new parties, and we see kind of the retirement of one of our great compromisers, Mr. Henry Clay. But Henry Clay is replaced by another very inept and skilled compromiser, Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois, which we're going to find out more about him with Lincoln. But so the Compromise of 1850 is really a collection of compromises. Think of it like a package. And what it promises to do is keep the Missouri Compromise alive. So basically keeping this balance of free and slave states as the United States expands. And so what it really tried to offer was kind of things that Northerners would be okay with and Southerners would be okay with as well, neither of which was completely satisfied, but each felt that they got enough of a piece of the pie to be happy. And so what we see within the compromise is that California is admitted as a free state. The rest of the land of the Mexican cession would be broken up into territorial governments, and there would not be slavery. The slave trade, not slavery itself, would be abolished in the capital. And what we really see in here, which is really going to cause more friction between the United States, is the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. And what that's really going to do, and it's put in there to appease Southerners, and Northerners are really upset about it, and Southerners want it because of the success of the Underground Railroad. All right, hey guys, we're back. So just to kind of wrap up this slide and talking about the Fugitive Slave Act. So again, it was put in there to appease Southerners who wanted something to be done about this over the success of the Underground Railroad, as of course you know, led by Harriet Tubman. We see Northerners starting to get really upset about the Fugitive Slave Act because they felt that they were being forced by this slave power that had control in the federal government and was essentially overriding the sovereignty of their individual states. So a state like Massachusetts might say that they're against enforcing the Fugitive Slave Act, and the federal government is going to say, no, thank you. You have to do this. And as you saw in the Story of Us on Friday, judges were paid $10 if they convicted someone of being a slave and sent them back into slavery, and only $5 if they set them free. So the economic incentive was certainly there to rule unfairly and unjustly as well. Kind of another thing that's going to come up is the Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, and this is really going to lead many Northerners to start to really question the morality and the political power of the slave South. Okay, so I'm going to turn it back to Mr. Vieira, who's going to kind of walk us through some of these maps.
All right, so here you have a map that is referencing the California Compromise, or the Compromise of 1850. It's called two different things in textbooks, so be prepared. It means the same exact thing. So according to the Compromise of 1850, California out west would become a free state, and a stricter fugitive slave law is passed, which pacifies and kind of makes Southern congressmen and senators agree to the bill, or to the compromise. So here you see a map kind of depicting the Underground Railroad. You can see areas in which, in the South, along the Cotton Belt, with larger slave populations, and then the free and the slave states. An important thing to remember about the Underground Railroad is safety wasn't the North if you were a fugitive slave or a runaway slave. Slavery was Canada. And as a result of...
Freedom was Canada.
Freedom was Canada. What did I say?
Slavery was Canada.
No, just in the winter.
Sure.
Freedom was Canada. So the goal was to get to Canada, obviously. And so federal judges, like Mr. Eskridge said, were given bonuses if they ruled in favor of the slaveholder against the runaway slave. So I get the luxury of talking about this handsome devil, Stephen Douglas. So the Kansas-Nebraska Territory, which you can see is right here in this area of your map, was set to be added to the United States of America. Now, these territories, which were part of the Louisiana Purchase, were north of 3630. As a result of that, north of 3630 meant that under the old Missouri Compromise agreement, that they would be free territories. Stephen Douglas knew that if that was the case, that the South would never agree to that, and Southerners would never agree to add that territory to the Union. So he proposes a compromise. Stephen Douglas's motivation behind this whole thing is a railroad, which is really relevant, but that's why a senator from Illinois is really getting involved here. So according to the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 and Stephen Douglas's bill, the anti-slavery line of 3630 would be kind of kaput. And the territory of, I'm going to go to this map because it's kind of easier to explain here. The territory of Nebraska and Kansas would be split in two, and the voters would get to decide through a process known as popular sovereignty whether or not those states would be added to the Union as a free or a slave state. So what that means is in Kansas would hold an election, and in their election they would either vote for entering the Union as a free state or entering the Union as a slave state. And the whole goal was that under popular sovereignty, the people of the state would get to decide. So you get a little bit more direct democracy. There's a couple of obvious flaws with that. First off, people that are enslaved do not have suffrage, and so didn't have a voice in the whole conversation. It also sets up a battleground in which future states would be politicized in a sense that if you were a slaveholder or if you were a pro-Southerner or if you were an abolitionist, it would be in your best interest to move into those territories so that you could have a voice in the election. And that's what we really begin to see once Kansas is set to join the Union. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act pretty much is the reversal of, in a lot of ways, the California Compromise and the Compromise of 1820. And it sets in motion sort of the battleground of the state of Kansas. I'll go ahead and just stick with this. The Kansas-Nebraska Act creates the Republican Party pretty much. The Republican Party is created as a alternative to the Democratic Party. And after the Kansas-Nebraska Act, there's a clear, the battle lines are clearly drawn. The Democrats are the slave-owning party of the South. The Republicans become the abolitionist party of the North. The first Republican candidate for president, oddly enough, is a Californian. John C. Fremont of California is the first candidate. He loses, but the Republicans kind of view the loss as a successful failure and that they did rather well, actually, considering the fact that they were a new political party. It's also important that in 1856, we get the kind of bursting onto the scene of a pretty important historical figure in American history, Abraham Lincoln. By 1856, Abraham Lincoln is starting to build a name for himself within the Republican Party. He is firmly a supporter of John C. Fremont in his quest to run for president. So one of the first major Republicans and the first Republican president is going to be Abraham Lincoln, and we're going to talk a lot about Lincoln over the next couple of weeks. So I'll kick it back over to Mr. Eskridge.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about Bleeding Kansas. So Bleeding Kansas is kind of the first the first violence that erupts in this evolving crisis for the country over the issue of slavery. And for a long time, the West and these new territory that were gained during this time period from the founding of the nation up until this time had really been kind of like the pressure valve on the country. And the fact that there was more land out to the west, there was more land for expansion for both individuals that wanted a free states and those that wanted slave states. It was out there. There was places to move. Once California entered the scene and became part of the United States, that really obviously there's an ocean to the west of us, and so that's really going to block expansion. So we start to see these things kind of erupt and eventually lead to all-out civil war. So Bleeding Kansas is the first issue of that, or instance of that. And so in Kansas, as part of that Kansas-Nebraska Act, the issue of slavery would be decided by popular sovereignty or decided by the people that inhabit that territory, that what will become a state. And so we have, as Mr. Vieira said, we have people flocking from the north that are anti-slavery, people flocking from the south that are pro-slavery, and they are trying to populate the Kansas territory as much as they possibly can so that when the election as to whether Kansas would be admitted as a free state or a slave state happened, one side or the other would take the vote, would win the day, and would have more representatives. And what eventually happens is Kansas sets up two state governments. One's pro-slavery, one's anti-slavery, and there's conflict between there. The majority of people that live in Kansas did, in fact, vote to be admitted as a free state. The federal government refused to accept those votes. And so a gentleman by the name of John Brown, who you see him over here with his dapper beard, he and his sons are really fervent anti-slavery advocates. And what they do is they go and they just murder 5 pro-slavery settlers in very brutal ways. And so this really kind of sets off what will eventually lead to the Civil War. And we're going to see John Brown come on the scene again prior to the Civil War. Okay. So two things on this slide, because we wrap this up here in a minute. There's 2 signals here. There's the Dred Scott decision, or Scott v. Sanford in 1857. Dred Scott was a slave living in Missouri, or a Missouri slave living in the Northern Territories. His slave master dies. He sues in federal court for his freedom. The Dred Scott decision is important and critical because the Supreme Court rules that slaves cannot sue for their freedom because slaves are not citizens. This is a clear signal to the nation that the federal government has the plan of extending slavery.
James Buchanan, probably the worst president we've ever had.